Malik's Saturday morning was like any other. The sun streamed through the open window of his modest room, casting a golden glow over the scattered papers from last week's homework. His mother's voice drifted up from downstairs, calling him to breakfast, but he was too absorbed in his thoughts to respond right away. He was a 16-year-old boy, known for his helpfulness around the neighborhood. It wasn't that he went out of his way to make a name for himself as a good kid, but he had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. As he sat at his desk, he gazed out the window, watching the familiar figures of his neighbors going about their usual Saturday routines. The older woman 2 doors down, Mrs. Thompson, caught his eye. He'd seen her around many times, but he had never really spoken to her much. She lived alone in a small weathered house, her husband having passed away years ago. He noticed her standing in the yard, trying to position an old antenna in an attempt to get a better signal for her TV. She looked frustrated, her frail hands struggling to maneuver the antenna. Malik had always been taught to help others, even when it was inconvenient. Without much thought, he grabbed his jacket and made his way down the street toward Mrs. Thompson's house. He hadn't been invited, nor had she asked for his help, but he couldn't ignore the image of her, struggling with the antenna as if she had nowhere else to turn. She was elderly, after all, and in need of assistance more often than not. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Malik called as he stepped into her yard. She looked up, startled, but then smiled faintly, her tired eyes crinkling at the edges. "Oh, Malik, you startled me there. I was just trying to fix this darn TV antenna, but I can't get it right. You wouldn't happen to know how to fix these things, would you?" Malik smiled back. "I think I can give it a try." He walked toward her, inspecting the antenna. It wasn't a complicated problem, just a loose connection, but Mrs. Thompson's shaking hands and frustrated sighs told him she'd been struggling with this for a while. "Thank you, dear. I'm always getting myself into these messes," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Malik couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he worked. It wasn't much, a quick twist here, a minor adjustment there, but it was enough to get the antenna working again. Within moments, the screen on Mrs. Thompson's old TV flickered to life. A smile spread across her face as the static cleared, revealing a crisp picture. She was practically beaming. "You did it," she exclaimed, her voice filled with gratitude. "I've been trying to get this working for weeks. I don't know what I'd do without you, Malik." Malik chuckled, a little embarrassed by the praise. It was no trouble at all. Just glad to help out. They stood there for a few moments, exchanging pleasantries. The neighborhood was quiet, the morning peaceful, with the only sounds being the chirping of birds and the distant hum of cars passing by. For a moment, Malik felt that simple, unspoken connection with the older woman. It wasn't about the TV or even the help he'd offered. It was about being there for someone when they needed it most. "Are you sure you're all right, Mrs. Thompson?" Malik asked, noticing that she seemed a little frailer than usual. She nodded but didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him for a long, quiet moment, as though weighing something in her mind. "I've been meaning to tell you, Malik," she said after a pause. "You're such a kind young man. Not everyone would have taken the time to help an old woman like me." Malik smiled, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the praise. "It's nothing, really." But Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip gentle but firm. "I know your mother, and I know you come from a good family. You're a rare one, Malik. There aren't many like you left in this world." The weight of her words lingered in the air between them. For a moment, Malik was unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to receiving such direct compliments. Most people just saw him as another quiet kid, but Mrs. Thompson saw something different, something he wasn't sure he saw in himself. "Well, thanks, Mrs. Thompson. I just do what I can." She nodded slowly, the faintest hint of tears in her eyes. "You're going to go far, Malik. You have a good heart. That's the most important thing." Malik didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought of himself as anything special, but hearing it from her, An elderly woman who had seen so much in her life made him feel like he might be on the right path after all. After a few more moments of quiet conversation, he said his goodbyes and headed back down the street toward his house. As he walked home, Malik couldn't help but think about the interaction. It felt good to help people, but there was something more to it this time. Something that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he had done something important, something that would stay with him. Little did he know that one simple act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The next day, a knock on his door would turn his world upside down in ways he couldn't even imagine. The kindness he had shown would soon be used against him in a way that would make him question everything he knew about trust, justice, and the true cost of doing the right thing. But for now, as Malik walked back to his house, he felt nothing but a sense of quiet satisfaction, a feeling that, in that moment, he had done something good. The next morning, Malik's peaceful routine was shattered by an unexpected knock on the door. It was still early, and his parents hadn't yet risen for the day. He stretched, rubbing his eyes as he heard the knock again, louder this time. He wasn't expecting anyone, and that unsettled feeling crept up his spine. With a frown, he padded down the hallway toward the door. When he opened it, his heart skipped a beat. There were 2 police officers standing on his porch, their uniforms crisply pressed, their expressions stern and unreadable. Malik Hayes, one of them asked, his voice deep and professional. "Yeah, that's me," Malik replied, his voice barely above a whisper, a knot tightening in his stomach. "Is there a problem, officers?" "We need to ask you a few questions," the second officer said, stepping forward slightly. "About an incident that occurred yesterday with your neighbor, Mrs. Thompson." A cold shiver ran down Malik's back. Mrs. Thompson. What could she possibly want with the police? He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd simply helped her fix her TV. But there was something in the officer's eyes that told him this wasn't just a simple inquiry. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. "What happened?" Malik asked, his voice trembling now. The first officer glanced at his partner before responding. "We received a report that you unlawfully entered Mrs. Thompson's home yesterday. She claims you took her television." Malik froze. His mouth went dry. "What? No, He could hardly get the words out. "I just helped her fix the TV. I didn't take anything." The officers exchanged a brief look, and the first one continued. "That's not what we were told. Mrs. Thompson said she didn't invite you in, but you were seen entering her house late yesterday afternoon. We need you to come down to the station and answer a few questions." Malik's world tilted on its axis. He stood there, trying to make sense of it. Mrs. Thompson had been so kind when he'd helped her. She had thanked him, even called him a good person. Now, just one day later, he was being accused of stealing from her. It didn't make any sense. I didn't steal anything," Malik said, his voice rising in a mix of confusion and frustration. "I swear, I helped her fix the TV. And that's it. I didn't take anything from her house." The second officer stepped forward, his voice colder now. "We're not saying you took anything, but it's a serious accusation. We need you to come with us so we can clear this up." Malik felt his heart pounding in his chest. How had things gotten this far so quickly? He had no idea what was going on, but he knew he was in over his head. He glanced at the officers, who were still waiting for him to make a move. Reluctantly, he nodded. "All right, I'll go with you. But I didn't do anything wrong." The officers didn't respond to his protests as they led him down the steps and into the waiting patrol car. As they drove through the quiet neighborhood, Malik tried to process what had just happened. He kept replaying the scene in his mind. The smile on Mrs. Thompson's face as he fixed her TV. The warmth of her words when she thanked him for helping. How could that sweet, elderly woman suddenly be accusing him of something like this? They arrived at the police station, and Malik was ushered inside, his mind racing with questions and fear. The officers led him to an interrogation room and sat him down, the bright fluorescent lights above buzzing softly. "Just tell us exactly what happened yesterday, Malik," the first officer instructed, sitting across from him. "From the moment you entered Mrs. Thompson's house to when you left." Malik took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He recounted the events as clearly as he could. How he had seen Mrs. Thompson struggling with the antenna, how he had gone over to help, and how he had fixed the TV in less than half an hour. He told them about the brief conversation they'd shared afterward, how she had thanked him for his help. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. "But she said you entered her house without permission," the second officer interrupted, his voice sharp. "That's not how she remembers it." "That's not true," Malik exclaimed, his frustration growing. "I only went in to help with the antenna. I didn't take anything from her. Why would I steal from her? She's an old woman, and I was just trying to do something nice for her." The officers didn't seem convinced. They pressed him for more details, asking about his movements, his relationship with Mrs. Thompson, even his background. Malik was growing increasingly agitated. The questions felt like an interrogation, and every answer he gave seemed to be met with more skepticism. "We're going to need to review the footage from the security cameras on your street," the first officer said after a long silence. "We'll be in touch." Malik sat there, stunned, as the officers left the room. His head was spinning. Mrs. Thompson had to know that he was innocent, that he had only been trying to help her. But if she was telling the police a different story, where did that leave him? Why had she done this? After what felt like hours, the officers returned with a new piece of information: the security footage from the street where Malik's car had been parked. They showed him a brief clip of his vehicle pulling up to Mrs. Thompson's house. It didn't reveal anything incriminating, but the officers seemed satisfied. Malik couldn't help but notice that in the footage, it looked like he had arrived much later than he remembered. "Your car was seen on the footage at 9:12 p.m., the second officer said. "What were you doing there at that time?" "I don't know," Malik muttered, his heart sinking. "I swear I left before dark. I didn't stay there that long." The officers exchanged another look. They didn't seem to believe him. The next few days were a blur of confusion and disbelief. Malik's friends and family tried to support him, but the more the story spread, the more divided the neighborhood became. Some believed him, but others were starting to question his innocence. How could someone as well-liked as Mrs. Thompson make such a serious accusation without reason? Malik spent hours thinking about the situation, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. His life had always been simple, but now everything seemed to be falling apart. How had his simple act of kindness turned into such a nightmare? The more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't just need to clear his name. He needed to uncover the truth, whatever it was, before it destroyed him completely. The days following the police visit felt like a blur to Malik. His world, once so familiar, was now fractured beyond recognition. He couldn't escape the feeling that something larger was at play, something that didn't make sense. His life had been turned upside down over something as simple as helping Mrs. Thompson fix her TV. But as the investigation continued, things became even more twisted. The rumors had started to spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some people believed he was innocent, but others whispered behind his back, casting doubts on his character. Malik couldn't even walk down the street without hearing snatches of conversation that made his skin crawl. The whispers of, "Did he really do it? And why would she lie about something like that?" followed him everywhere. It felt like his entire community had been turned against him, as if one small act of kindness had somehow set off a chain reaction of judgment and suspicion. Malik couldn't stop replaying the sequence of events in his mind. The moment he'd walked into Mrs. Thompson's house to help, the words of gratitude she'd spoken, the smile on her face, it all felt like a distant memory now, one that was slipping further and further away. He'd never thought that helping someone could lead to such a nightmare, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Why would Mrs. Thompson accuse him? It didn't make sense. Malik's heart ached as he listened to her words. He had never considered the possibility that Mrs. Thompson's actions were rooted in the fear of being invisible and forgotten. He had always seen her as a sweet, kind old lady who had just needed help, but now he realized there was so much more to her story than he had known. "I'm so sorry, Malik," she whispered again, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to ruin your life." Malik didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to scream at her for putting him through so much pain, but another part of him, one he hadn't expected, felt compassion for her. She had been alone, lost in her own struggle, and in that moment, Malik understood that sometimes people made mistakes out of fear, not malice. But that didn't change the fact that his life had been torn apart. The police were still investigating. The rumors still lingered, and Mrs. Thompson's confession, though it brought him some relief, couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. "I don't know what to do now," Malik said, his voice barely audible. "I can't just go back to the way things were. People don't trust me anymore." Mrs. Thompson looked at him with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. "I know, Malik. I know I can't undo what's been done. But maybe we can try to fix this together." Malik's mind raced as he sat there, trying to process the offer. Could he forgive her? Could he move on from the damage he had caused? The path forward wasn't clear, but for the first time in days, Malik felt like there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days after his conversation with Mrs. Thompson felt like a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. Malik couldn't shake the weight of what had happened, but he was also wrestling with the unexpected sense of understanding that had started to grow between him and the elderly woman. Her confession had been a twist he never could have anticipated. She hadn't just lied to the police to save face. She had lied because she was terrified of being invisible, forgotten, and alone. Yet, as much as he wanted to believe her, Malik still felt the sting of betrayal. The damage had been done, and his reputation had taken a serious hit. Despite Mrs. Thompson's apology, the fallout from the accusation continued to spread. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. Now, people were openly questioning Malik's character, his integrity. Teachers who had once praised him for his kindness now treated him with subtle distance, as if there was a lingering doubt they couldn't shake. His friends, too, had begun to withdraw, unsure of where they stood in the mess he found himself in. Malik had always been the quiet, reliable kid, the one you could count on. But now he was the kid accused of theft, and no one seemed willing to listen to his side of the story. His family, though supportive, was beginning to show signs of stress. His mother, usually the strong, steady presence in their home, had started to argue with Malik's father more frequently. She was upset about the way the neighborhood was turning against them, about how people seemed to believe the worst without knowing the truth. His father, on the other hand, spent hours on the phone with a lawyer, trying to figure out the next step, the best way to clear Malik's name. But no matter how much they tried to fix things, the truth was that the damage was done. Malik found himself retreating further into himself, spending hours in his room, scrolling through social media posts and reading about the ongoing investigation. The public opinion was split down the middle. Some people, Malik's few remaining friends, believed in his innocence and spoke out in his defense. Others, however, were convinced he was guilty. The narrative had already been set in people's minds, and it was hard to fight against it. Every time Malik heard his name mentioned in passing, it felt like a dagger to his heart. No one cared about the truth anymore. They only cared about the story they had already decided was real. Then, one evening, everything changed. Malik had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room, staring out the window at the neighborhood, when he heard a knock at the door. It was late, much later than usual. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced toward his parents, who exchanged uneasy looks. His mother motioned for Malik to answer it, and he slowly made his way to the door. When he opened it, he was not prepared for what he saw. Standing there, at the doorstep, was Mrs. Thompson. She looked different, worn, fragile, and pale. Her usual frail composure was gone, replaced by an almost frantic energy that immediately put Malik on edge. "Malik, I need to talk to you," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice shaking with urgency. "Mrs. Thompson," Malik said, bewildered. He hadn't expected her to come back so soon. He had assumed their conversation was behind them. "What's going on?" Before he could process what was happening, she pushed past him into the house, moving with a sense of urgency that left him stunned. His parents stood frozen in the kitchen, watching the exchange with growing concern. Malik felt a mix of dread and confusion. Mrs. Thompson had never come to their house unannounced like this. Her sudden appearance only fueled his unease. "I'm sorry to barge in like this," she began, her eyes wide with a panic that was impossible to ignore. "But I need to tell you something. I've made a terrible mistake. The police. She faltered, struggling to find the right words. Malik's heart began to race. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "I lied again, Malik. The truth isn't what I told you. It's much worse." Mrs. Thompson's voice cracked as she spoke. "I didn't just accuse you of stealing the TV. I made up the whole story. Everything. But the worst part is that it's all connected to something much bigger than either of us." Malik stood there, frozen. His mind was spinning, trying to grasp the gravity of what she was saying. What could possibly be bigger than what had already happened? What more was there to the story? "Mrs. Thompson, what are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked down, visibly shaking. "There's something you don't know. Something I should have told you sooner, but I was too scared. It's about the TV. You see, it wasn't really mine." Malik blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. "What do you mean? You said it was your TV." "It wasn't," Mrs. Thompson whispered. "It was stolen. And not just that, it was stolen from someone who isn't exactly law-abiding." Malik's mind raced. "What? You're saying you've been hiding a stolen TV?" Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't want to be a part of it, but I had no choice. These men, came to my house one night. They said if I didn't take the TV, they would hurt me. They said they would make my life hell. So I agreed. I had no other choice, Malik. But now, they're coming after me. They know I helped you, and they'll think you know too much. I'm so sorry. I never wanted any of this to happen. I never wanted you to get dragged into this mess." The room fell silent as Malik tried to process the magnitude of what he was hearing. He had no idea who she was talking about, but the fear in Mrs. Thompson's eyes was all too real. His first instinct was to protect his family, to keep them safe from whatever danger Mrs. Thompson had just unleashed. But how could he protect anyone when he was in the middle of it all? How could he possibly fix the mess he had made of his life? Mrs. Thompson clutched her hands together, her voice trembling with emotion. "Please, Malik, you have to understand. You need to stay away from me. You have to tell the police the truth, that I lied. I didn't mean for it to get this far, but now it's too late. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Malik felt the weight of her words sinking in. His life was spiraling out of control. And now, this revelation about stolen goods, shady men, and fear-driven lies had taken everything to a level he hadn't even imagined. There was no going back now. As much as he wanted to believe that things could be fixed, he knew it was too late. The truth was darker and more dangerous than he could ever have anticipated. Malik looked at his parents, their faces etched with confusion and concern, but there was no time for answers, no time for explanations. They were now all caught in a web of lies that neither he nor Mrs. Thompson had ever intended to spin. The only question left was how he would navigate the chaos that had been set in motion, and whether he could ever rebuild his life from the pieces left behind. Malik sat silently at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of everything Mrs. Thompson had just revealed. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on him from all sides. His parents, still reeling from the shock of her sudden, urgent visit, exchanged glances but didn't speak. Malik felt their eyes on him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet their gaze. He had been dragged into something far beyond his control, something that had started with a simple act of kindness, but had now spiraled into something dark and dangerous. Mrs. Thompson's revelation about the stolen TV and the men threatening her hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known that something didn't add up, but he never could have imagined this. How could he have known that his act of helping her with something as trivial as her television would lead to this web of deceit and criminality? And worse, how could he have known that he would become entangled in her lies, her fears, and the consequences of her choices? Malik wanted to be angry at her, to scream for dragging him into a mess that was never his doing, but he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of sympathy for her either. She had been terrified, alone, and in her panic, she had made decisions that had hurt not just herself, but everyone around her. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and more unanswered questions. Malik's parents had called their lawyer, who was now working tirelessly to try and clean up the mess that Mrs. Thompson had created. The lawyer advised them to go to the police with the truth, to explain that Mrs. Thompson had lied. But Malik knew that the truth was now tainted by suspicion. Even if the authorities believed him, the damage to his reputation in the community was irreversible. People had already made up their minds, and the gossip would continue to spread. It was impossible to stop the flow of rumors once it had started. Malik had started to become a ghost in his own life. He no longer walked down the street with his head held high. Instead, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might look at him with distrust. The kids at school who had once called him a friend now whispered behind his back, barely acknowledging him in the hallways. Teachers who used to ask him to help with after-school activities now seemed to avoid him altogether, their smiles strained whenever he passed by. Malik wasn't just fighting for his innocence anymore. He was fighting for his identity. Who was he if people no longer saw him as the kind, reliable kid they had once known? His home had become a battleground of sorts. His parents were trying to stay strong, but the tension was palpable. They had done everything right. They had raised him with values, taught him to be respectful, to help others. But none of that mattered now. The world had changed overnight, and Malik didn't know how to make it right. He was afraid for his future, afraid that his past kindness would be forever overshadowed by a lie that wasn't even his own. And then, just when things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, the men Mrs. Thompson had mentioned in passing appeared. Malik had been sitting in his room one evening, trying to do his homework, when he heard the distinct sound of a car pulling up in front of the house. At first, he didn't think anything of it. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to stop by, or for someone to visit. But the knock at the door came just minutes later, sharp and insistent. His father answered it, and Malik heard muffled voices, followed by a moment of silence. Then his father's voice, lower and more serious than he had ever heard it before, echoed through the hallway. "Malik," his father called sharply. "Come out here now." Malik's heart skipped. He had never heard his father use that tone. With a sinking feeling, he stood up from his desk and walked down the hall. His mother was already in the living room, her eyes wide with fear. And there, standing just inside the doorway, were two men. They looked like they didn't belong in this neighborhood. They were dressed in dark jackets, their faces unreadable, their presence too imposing for comfort. "These men are looking for you, Malik," his father said quietly, his voice tight with restraint. Malik felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't need to ask any more questions. He knew who they were. These were the men Mrs. Thompson had warned him about, the ones who had threatened her, the ones who had put her in a position where she felt like she had no choice but to drag him into her lies. "I need to talk to you," one of the men said, his voice gravelly and cold. "Privately." Malik's father stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here, The morning he finally made the decision, he walked into the living room where his parents were sitting, their faces drawn with exhaustion. He told them what he was planning to do. At first, they hesitated, their faces filled with concern and fear. They knew how dangerous things had become, how precarious the situation was. But after a long silence, his father spoke. "Malik, this isn't just about telling your side of the story anymore. There are people involved in this who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. If you go to the police, you're making a target of yourself. You'll be putting us all at risk." Malik nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was about to do. "I know, Dad, but I can't live like this. I can't let them control my life. I didn't do anything wrong. And if I don't stand up for myself, no one else will." His mother reached out and touched his arm, her eyes filled with both pride and fear. "We'll support you, Malik. Whatever happens, we're with you." It was then that Malik knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't alone in this fight. His parents, despite their own fear, were standing behind him. They weren't going to let him face this darkness by himself. He left the house that afternoon, a sense of determination rising within him. As he walked to the police station, he couldn't help but feel the weight of every step. This wasn't just a matter of clearing his name. It wasn't just about Mrs. Thompson's lies. It was about his life, his future. It was about showing the world that he wasn't just some victim who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was Malik Hayes, a young man who deserved to be heard. When he reached the station, the familiar cold metal doors and sterile hallways did nothing to calm his nerves. He felt like a stranger here, as if he were about to step into a world he wasn't prepared for. But he walked up to the desk and spoke his name, the words leaving his mouth with more confidence than he felt inside. He was taken into an interview room, and for the first time in days, he felt like he was finally in control. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't cowering. He was going to tell his side of the story, and he wasn't going to back down. The officer who met him was the same one who had spoken to him before, the one who had been skeptical and distant. He looked up from his desk when Malik entered, his expression unreadable. "You're here to tell us what happened?" the officer asked, his voice low. "Yes," Malik said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "I'm here to clear my name. I didn't steal anything from Mrs. Thompson. I didn't even take anything from her house. I was just trying to help her. I didn't know about the stolen TV. I didn't know she was in trouble. But I do now, and I want to tell you the truth." The officer sat back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Go ahead. We're listening." And so, Malik told them everything. He recounted the events leading up to that day, the way he had helped Mrs. Thompson, the kindness that had driven him to fix her TV. He told them about her confession, about the men who had threatened her, and the fear that had driven her to lie. He explained everything, leaving no detail out, no part of the story untold. It wasn't easy, it wasn't simple, but it was the truth. When he was finished, the officer was silent for a long moment. Malik could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But then, to his surprise, the officer nodded slowly. "We'll investigate what you've said. If what you're telling us checks out, we'll take the necessary steps. But you should know, this is bigger than you think. These men, whoever they are, aren't going to give up easily." Malik felt a wave of uncertainty crash over him. He had told the truth, but that didn't mean the danger was gone. In fact, it felt like things were only getting more complicated, more dangerous. But he had made a choice. He had taken a stand, and there was no turning back now. The truth was out. And no matter what happened next, Malik knew one thing for certain. He had chosen to fight for his future. He had chosen to live, not as a victim of circumstances, but as someone who had the power to decide his own fate. When Malik walked out of the police station, the weight on his shoulders hadn't disappeared. The fear hadn't completely gone away, but something else had shifted in him, something more powerful than the fear: hope. For the first time in weeks, Malik felt like he was moving forward, like he had taken control of his life again. And maybe, just maybe, things would start to get better.